Hello, everyone. In today's show, we're going to look at how the US government wanted to prepare its citizens for nuclear war. We're also going to go to Brazil and China to try to get a better understanding of the monetary order. And lastly, we have identified possibly a suspect from July that may have inflected the reopening boom from V-shaped to sort of more meandering upside down U. This show is called Making Sense. It's a Eurodollar University production. My name is Emil Kalinowski, and the we is Jeff Snyder is joining me. He's the head of global research for Alhambra Investments. Jeff, I'm really excited about this first article that we're going to talk about. How are you?
Good. And I think we're going to start with nuclear war, so it couldn't possibly get any hotter than that, right? I mean,
oh, that's good, Jeff.
thermonuclear right. Devices and H-bombs. Let's get it kicked right off.
What a way to start the weekend. And people say that we're doom and gloomers. But why shouldn't we start with nuclear war? You know what? Let's look at it from the perspective of something fuzzy and cuddly, and that is Bert the turtle. So, Jeff, today is, what is today? Today is what day is it? I don't know what day it is.
Today is the 18th.
The 18th. And so today at Real Clear Markets, they posted your essay. And the essay is titled, Powell as Bert, Duck and Cover. And the short essay of yours is about Bert the turtle. And I guess we gave it away. It has something to do with thermonuclear war, but I thought you were going towards maybe you were branching out from the monetary, from the mathematical, towards children toys. Is that maybe, what snapped, Jeff? Why did you finally want to go into children's toys and merchandise?
Well, I think there's a pretty good analogy here, and it gets back to, we'll get into this in a little bit, but it's really about what do authorities do in the face of the extreme, right? Nuclear war is probably the most extreme any government will ever have to face. And it's kind of, it seems like almost a preposterous position, because what are you going to do if the atom bombs start falling? Really, what's the point? And I think that's really the point is for a government, it's not really about what happens if the war happens. It's what do you do in advance of it, and how do you counteract the potential negative forces that can come about just from the potential of a downside so big and so large. And of course, given what we're talking about in our show, Eurodollar University, there's a monetary analogy that goes along with it.
That's right. And so it seems overwhelming and impossible, but you just can't sit back and let it happen. You've got to do something. And on January 12th, 1951, 16 months after the Soviet Union first tested their nuclear weapon, US President Harry Truman created the Federal Civil Defense Administration. Tell us about it and Project East River.
Well, the FCDA was created to essentially, try to figure out what could we do to the internal American public about the prospect of any kind of future war that would involve nuclear weapons. As you pointed out, the Soviet Union detonated their first atomic bomb in 1949, and that set off a wave of not quite, but low, not quite panic, but a low rumbling boil of apathy and even fatalism about, if these bombs start dropping, what's the point? It's going to destroy everything. And the government recognized that, look, you can't have that. I mean, we've got to be prepared in some respects for any kind of contingency, because to not do so would be even worse. And so they created the Federal Civil Defense Administration, and one of its first acts was to commission a study from what the Associated Universities Incorporated, which is, I believe, a consortium of 8 Ivy League schools, and they gathered together the top scientists, not in the Indiana Jones version of top men, but actual real top scientists who looked at a potential nuclear war and thought, well, what do we need to do? I mean, what does the military need to do to reduce the damage? What can civilians do to increase their chances of survival? And that's what became known as Project East River. And Project East River identified right off the bat this fatalism, this apathy among the American public as potentially the biggest stumbling block to conducting any kind of conflagration where nuclear weapons were involved. And, the idea was, look, we got to get the public to realize that, not everybody's going to die here, that you can survive, that, these things can be done. And so what a major finding of the study was something that later became to be called emotion management. Get people thinking that there are ways that they could prepare themselves to survive a potential catastrophic scenario, even a catastrophic scenario.
Emotions management, survivor's euphoria, and expectations policy. I know there's a Venn diagram where we'll find some overlap with all of those. Let me read a quote from the final report that you identified of Project East River from 1952 that speaks to that fatalism. Quote, "The average American citizen is not greatly concerned over the manner in which he is picked up after he has been killed, but he is much interested in increasing his chances of survival." First of all, I really appreciate the fact that it's so straightforward and not covered in jargon or doesn't take a position. It's very clear, very stark. And therefore, how do you overcome that? You have a cartoon turtle.
Right. If you believe you're going to be slaughtered, then it doesn't matter what you do today. And of course, I think our audience is astute enough to start seeing the analogy work out in markets and the Fed and all that stuff. But what the FDCA came up with was they were going to produce educational films, among other things. And there was a series of 9 of them, which were, I think one of them was firefighting techniques for households or something like that, the kind of things that, we think about, like, this is ridiculous. And of course, the most famous one was Bert the Turtle. Bert the Turtle taught essentially school children to, I think what people will remember is people our age and people older, baby boomers in particular, will remember duck and cover. Duck and cover was the famous, air raid drill technique where when your teacher yelled drop, you got underneath your desk and covered your head with your hands, and that would allow you to survive a nuclear impact. And it sounds completely ridiculous to people in the modern age because it's a nuclear weapon. What good is it to be under your desk holding your head underneath your hands? But at the time, in the early 1950s, nuclear weapons were not these mega weapons that we have today. They were more like the bombs that were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So there was some minor validity to, if you have school children in school and a small yield nuclear weapon goes off somewhere near them, their biggest danger is not the nuclear blast, it's the blast blowing windows in, and so flying glass shards and things like that. Duck and cover might actually be somewhat helpful and useful. It's only later, and not that much later, I think the first H-bomb came about in 1954, and then of course the proliferation of thermonuclear weapons thereafter. That's when duck and cover really became an object of derision because it was absurd. I mean, a thermonuclear weapon going off, duck and cover is not going to do anything. But yet, the Federal Civil Defense Administration and Bert the Turtle soldiered onward, even under the new nuclear threat, that was so much bigger. So the idea was just to get people thinking that, okay, you could do something positive to help your chances of survival. And if you think even remotely that you'll be able to survive, you might act positively before anything bad actually happens. That's emotion management.
Well, some segues are better than others. Let us tie the two concepts together by looking at what happened 1 year ago. So today's the 18th. 1 year ago and 2 days ago, what happened?
Well, I think it was the equivalent of the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? We had a September repo rumble, September of 2019, right in the middle of the month, right at the bottleneck. All of a sudden, this major disruption in the repo market, and it was such a big disruption that for the first time since maybe 2008, the word repo was entering the mainstream financial press, and even just the regular mainstream press. People were talking about the repo market and what the hell's going on here. Something big must have happened. Even the Federal Reserve is being forced into doing something it doesn't want to do. And so, here's this thing that happened, and really a year later, nobody's really offered much by way of official explanations for what happened. I believe that the Federal Reserve would prefer to keep it that way. Just everybody to go back to sleep and not think about it.
The Cuban Missile Crisis, one of those books behind me, is called Averting the Final Failure, and it's based on the recordings that Kennedy had, their audio recordings of his deliberations, and it reads like the most incredible Hollywood thriller, but it was real life. It was unbelievable, that whole sequence. I recommend if anyone wanted to read a Hollywood thriller, espionage thriller, just read what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Let me get you back to the repo failure. So the repo market, it's an interbank funding market, very important. You've called it the ultimate backstop as the real central banks, per se, of international capital flows. And last year, something went wrong. And a lot of people will say, but there's two misconceptions, and I want to bring them out right now. The first one is that the Federal Reserve then stepped in and started conducting repo operations, taking over from the private market. You've written numerous times that's not what they did. And people are confused about that. Why is what the Fed did last year not really repo market operations?
Because it had nothing to do with the repo market. The Fed was not in the repo market offering bank reserves to anybody else in the repo market. The Federal Reserve conducted off-market transactions with only primary dealers that mimicked what was essentially a repo trade. In other words, primary dealers had to put up collateral in order to exchange and get a loan of bank reserves back from the Fed. That had nothing to do with the repo market. It mimicked a repo trade, but it wasn't in the repo market. What the Fed was attempting to do was think, well, if I give the primary dealers some more bank reserves, they'll then use those bank reserves in the repo market. They'll go into the repo market. So it's already one step removed from repo. And again, it's basically the same thing with the Fed. Everything to them looks like, when all you have is a hammer, everything's nails, right? So it's always bank reserves, always bank reserves. So their explanation, or at least what they're implying by these repo operations, was that the repo market, like everything else, must have been short of bank reserves. And so if we offer bank reserves to the primary dealers will be satisfied. They'll offer their own liquidity to the repo market, and everyone will be happy and go home satisfied.
It's remarkable how it's the exact same story that they had been trying to tell everyone since 2008. There's not enough credit in the economy. We need to get the economy moving. Therefore, we will give reserves to the primary dealers, and then they will go out into the rest of the market. They didn't do that broadly, and then they tried it again in this narrower interbank market, and again, it didn't work. It's remarkable how it...
Yeah, and Emil, that's a really good point, because if you really look at what the Federal Reserve does, or any central bank for that matter, it's exactly the same thing. How do we give the bank system bank reserves? So QE, repo operations, all of these other programs are essentially that. They're different ways of doing the same thing. So the Fed is trying to convince you that there's various types of QEs and each one's better than the last, when each of them are exactly what you said. How do we give bank reserves to the banking system? That's all they ever are. That's all they are.
And then, all right, our time is short, but it just obviously, and I don't know, obviously the bottleneck is the dealers don't want to do it anymore. Let us move on.
If the dealers don't want to do it, as they prove, that was the key element of last September's repo rumble, was that dealers faced with skyrocketing repo rates, which were a shortage of liquidity in the repo markets, instead of chasing those skyrocketing repo rates, which is what money dealing is supposed to be about, right? You're supposed to be making money in dealing money. So there was enormous profits. A repo rate in the double digits could make your whole damn year for your desk. Why weren't they chasing those profits? In fact, it was what we call backwards elasticity. Backwards elasticity is when the price rises, the dealers offer even less liquidity. And that's really all about, you see the repo rate rise and rise and rise, and you think something must be wrong. I'm going to get out. You can pull further to the sideline, not go into the market like you're supposed to do. So it was a very clear indication that something was really wrong, and that faced with something really wrong in the marketplace, dealers were going to get out of it, that's the message the Fed should have taken away, was not that there was a shortage of bank reserves, that there was a shortage of willingness on the part of dealers to step in exactly the way we need them to. And of course, that leads us into, obviously, what happened in March, when the real deal finally hit. Because as I said last year, many times, what happened in September was nothing more than a dress rehearsal. Well, the real deal, the real play, the real show actually showed up in March, and guess what happened? For a period of a little more than 2 weeks, money dealers did exactly what they had done in September, only on a much, much larger and more destructive scale.
And second most popular misconception is that there were too many treasuries in the market at that time, and that's what caused the repo meltdown. What do you say to that?
Yeah, and I think that, most of the people who used to say that no longer say that because it's kind of obvious that it was never the problem. I mean, we talked about this before, and I've written about it extensively. If there were too many treasuries being held by primary dealers, they could have sold them to the public at any time because the price of those treasuries was at an increasing rate, an increasing level. So if holding treasuries had ever been a problem for any primary dealer, they had a very profitable option of selling them easily to the financial public that wanted any number of them at almost any price. So the idea that there's too many treasuries doesn't match up with actual market prices. Auction, non-market, secondary market, whatever price you want to use, the treasury market has said there's demand for it across all levels. And there's no reason to suspect, no reason to believe that dealers therefore are doing anything other than choosing to hold treasuries, because they could easily sell them at any amount, at any price, at any time. And so if they're holding them, it's because they want to hold them. And that leads us into, why the hell would they want to hold them?
Well, answer that question. Well, I guess it's obvious because there's a disorder in place. But here's another curiosity I have that I want to ask you about. The Fed was not buying US Treasury securities across the board. They were buying very specific kinds of US Treasury securities. Tell the audience which ones and why it mattered.
Yeah, in response to last September's repo problem, there was not just these quote-unquote repo operations that were not repo operations. The other part of it, maybe even the more important part of it from the Fed's perspective, was their not QE program. Remember, they made a big deal about how this was not QE, but it was sort of QE. We're going to buy some treasuries, but we don't want you to believe it's QE because we don't think the problem's that big, right? And really, it gets back to what we just said. What the Fed was intending to do was, how do you raise the level of bank reserves for the banking system, but do it on a more permanent basis? The repo operations were a temporary increase in bank reserves, where a QE or asset purchase program is a permanent increase in bank reserves. So that's really what the Fed wanted to do, was they wanted to say this repo problem was only a small, temporary, local repo problem. And therefore, it didn't require a full QE, but yet we need to raise the permanent level of bank reserves. Therefore, we have to do something that looks like QE. And so to distinguish this not QE from a regular QE, they said, well, we'll just buy treasury bills, and we'll stick to just buying treasury bills so that the public knows that this is a technical monetary issue and not a full stimulus, because we don't think that the country needs the economy needs a full stimulus. And I said at the time, numerous times, it was the biggest mistakes they could possibly make, because what they were doing was intentionally stripping the repo system of its most valuable, most usable, most demanded collateral possible. They were leaving it in even worse shape after September, when dealers had already told them, look, we're on edge. We're going to jump at the first sign of trouble. And then we're going to jump because there's a shortage of collateral in the system. And now you're taking even more of the best collateral. And of course, as we saw in March, what happened? It all went into the T-bills. The entire liquidations globally matched up and aligned perfectly with everything we saw in T-bills, where everybody was jumping to find T-bills because on-the-run treasuries were the only usable collateral in some spaces. So the Fed made an enormous mistake in this not QE program by making things even worse heading into March. First of all, they didn't heed the warning from September, what dealers were going to do, and then they stripped the system of T-bills at the worst possible time. And so then when we did finally experience the shock, I think it made everything that much worse.
Jeff, there are at least two kinds of people commenting, maybe three, on the Fed. There's the people that believe they're doing a good job. There's the people that are saying they're not doing a good job. And then there's also a very big contingent of people who say it's a conspiracy, a cabal, that there's evil intent. And in October of last year, you wrote that what you just explained, that it's difficult, or that you struggle with explaining how it's not a conspiracy, how you know what I'm saying, that in your own words, you were saying they took out the most liquid form of collateral from the system, harming it terribly. How, and it's so easy to think that's a conspiracy.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that that either they're that really stupid because they did the worst possible thing. What if you were actually sitting back last year and thinking, okay, we're going to have a shock in March. How can I make it the absolute worst it can possibly be? Well, I know. I'll just buy all the Treasury bills. I'll take the Treasury bills out of circulation, and that if we have a shock in March, that'll make things absolutely the worst it can possibly be. And so you have to wonder sometimes, are they really that evil? I know a lot of people will say, yeah, they are, but no, they're not. And we addressed this before when we talked about, was Aristotle an idiot? No, Aristotle was not an idiot. Jay Powell's not an idiot. Ben Bernanke, not an idiot. Not only are they not morons, they're also not evil. They understand the system as it was 60 years ago. That's really all it is. They have not caught up to the modern monetary system, and they believe that emotion management is the way that they actually conduct monetary policy. Because if you actually pin Jay Powell down tomorrow under oath, under pain of long prison sentence, he would admit to you, we have no idea how to define money. We have no idea how the system uses money. Therefore, our job is to try to convince the banking system through bank reserves to act in a way that we want the banking system to act, because we freaking have no idea what they're doing. That's what Jay Powell would say. They're not evil. They're not stupid. They just haven't caught up to the modern system. And it's again, getting back to what we talked about at the beginning here, Bert the Turtle, that's really all bank reserves are. They're a way to signal to everybody to duck and cover. When you see something big happen, like last September's repo rumble, let's give out bank reserves and everybody will assume the duck and cover position, and they'll be happy. They'll think that, okay, now I can survive something if it actually happens, which is, in the modern thermonuclear repo age, it's absolutely ridiculous, and it's utterly absurd, because their bank reserves program was for a different time. It was for a different place, for a different world that doesn't any longer exist. And that's really the key to understanding both what the Federal Reserve does and why it does what it does, and also why it never succeeds.
Jeff, a little bit off topic. Last question of this section. Whenever I go to a espionage thriller movie like Tenet, they talk about preventing World War III. Whenever that comes up, I always bristle, because I consider the Cold War as World War III. What do you think? Am I wrong, or should we consider that as World War III already having been fought over some 50 years?
Yeah, I think you're right, Emil. And not only that, I mean, to the people who were subjected to the proxy wars fought between the United States and the Soviet Union, it didn't look very cold to them, did it? So, I mean, yeah, it was a continuous conflict, and it was a low intensity conflict. There were no nuclear strikes or anything like that, but that doesn't mean it was any less of a war and a conflict. And it was in some ways an existential conflict.
It's just one of my things, Jeff. All right, so that segment was sponsored 100% unofficially by George Gammon's recent interview of Jeff Snyder and Lynn Alden. Anyone that's watching the show that hasn't seen that interview, I highly recommend it. Just go to YouTube and search George Gammon, Lynn Alden, and Jeff Snyder. You're going to love that show. I know I did. Jeff, that was a great job.